about all the live trees in our landscape and how they relate to us, but we seldom talk about the dead trees that we nail to our house in the form of fences and decks that can override even the best design home. And that's what we see very often is it's very sad to see a predominantly non-combustible home burned to the ground because somebody attached a wick or a fuse to it unintentionally. So the little things really matter when it comes to home losses, and we've documented that case after case. Steiner Ranch homes, and apologize for those who were involved and experienced that loss, were predominantly ignition-resistant homes, by and large. And so there's one other thing that really worries us about homes, and this is the main reason why we see losses. We've documented it in Texas over the last 10 years, as other researchers have, embers. And so we've all been sitting around a campfire and seen the ember pop off every once in a while. So during a wildfire, what you can visualize is a blizzard of embers. And those embers are being pushed ahead of the fire by very strong winds. And they penetrate your vents, your soffits, your unenclosed areas, and they land in the same places that wind would gather leaves or other debris. They can get in your attic and land on all those boxes from the last move that you didn't need that we stuck up there because we didn't want to go through it. And so it's the little things that we need to really focus on, because by and large our homes are being built ignition resistant. Unless you live in a much older home, the probability is just a few small things that you need to do to button that structure up, that if you don't, I can guarantee you fire will find that weak link, will find that path of least resistance and follow it until it reaches the structure, and it won't go out until somebody puts it out. I know it seems kind of like a duh, but here's the reality in wildfires, and I'm going to back up and explain. If homes don't ignite, they don't burn. So that's different than in a structure fire. If a home ignites, there's folks that show up and put it out. During the Bastrop scenario, if the home ignites and nobody's there to put it out, it doesn't matter if it's one little ember on the corner of your deck. It stays there and it burns and smolders, and there's no one to do anything about it. And so the reality is approaching your home from that standpoint of standalone can only enhance the fire department's capability if they are able to access it. So let's make sure we don't operate under the assumption that looks good is good, and we'll talk about those nuances. And so what I'd like to do is walk everybody through a virtual assessment. Typically with our workshop, we get out and we walk around a building or a structure. You can kind of see off the edge of this deck. This kind of precludes us doing that. We might step outside and look at what we have as a classic example of interface and intermix right out the window. All of the factors that David talked about, the slope, the vegetation, all those topographical issues, and houses at the top of the ridge where we all know heat rises, right? So any fire happening at the bottom of the ridge is not just heating the fuels, the vegetation ahead of it, it's preheating the home. And like we talked about, dead wood burns a lot quicker than live trees, and so your deck, your siding is being preheated and dried out by the fire running up the hill. So this is a great example of what we're dealing with. Everybody on your table has a copy of the NFPA Home Ignition Zone form. Everybody got that and got a pen? If you get this done, you won't have any homework. We also have some folks in the room standing against that back wall who have gone through the training to conduct risk assessment. We have some individuals in the room that we've trained as well, that we've done a train the trainer so they can conduct assessments in their community. Lana is one of those, Joyce and others. So if you're lucky enough to have one of those at your table, you can cheat a little bit. But we're going to walk through a virtual assessment, and I intentionally chose a community that experienced losses that wasn't Austin because it's tough sometimes to see what the impacts in your own community are, and the chances are that somebody in this community has experienced wildfire. So I want to create a little bit of emotional buffer so we can be objective about it, but also realize that the dynamics of what caused home to ignite are the same regardless of what type of vegetation you're in. And eliminating our native vegetation is not possible, and it's unacceptable. So want to make sure we understand that fire can burn in any ecosystem, whether it's grass or brush. and we need to factor that in. This is a fire we're going to be looking at in a community that was predominantly grass. How many of you have been out to Fort Davis? Beautiful West Texas, the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, very dry, very often in desert-like conditions throughout the lower elevations. You get a little bit higher, you start to get some pine trees and firs, but predominantly in town, it was grass and creosote and sagebrush throughout the landscape. Not a lot of fuel, but a very big impact. That fire traveled 26 miles in about 3 hours. And so extremely fast, some of the fastest fire behavior we've seen in Texas history, something that you can't outrun, and just shows if we can lose homes to grass, that we can certainly lose homes in more intense fires. So we're going to go through this checklist, and as we do, what I would like to ask as we make note, work your way down the checklist, make a few notes for yourself, things that you think that stand out that may be good, bad, or ugly. This form isn't what Joyce was referencing, which if you all did a risk assessment in this room, how could we relate you to each other? So maybe Joyce is 100 and someone else is a 50, and that 50 is in better shape than Joyce. That's not what this assessment form is about. It's qualitative. We want to leave folks with answers, things they can implement, not wondering what high risk means to them. So this is solution-based. And this is what folks like our wildland team can offer to members of the community, and especially in the form of Train the Trainer. So let's take a look, and sorry if it's a little bit bleached out. This is from the Fort Davis fire. What you can see is the fire burned into town along this corridor, this road. This was a finger of the fire and a backing finger of the fire. There's some topography and a ridge line here. And so we'll start talking about it from just an overview of the surroundings. What is this general area and what's our access? You can see there's one road that leads off the road winding up this hill to this particular home. So at this point it kind of looks like they have a couple options, but the reality is they all lead to one place, bottleneck. And so access is a factor in determining what your risk, especially to your personal safety, is, and the ability for firefighters to get there. If there's 100 residents trying to move down this hill, firefighters have to help them get out before they can start protecting structure and natural resources. So this is the actual structure at the top of that hill. So just kind of looking at it from that overview of surroundings, how's this structure positioned in relation to fire behavior? If you can kind of tell this dark area, that's slopes and vegetation. So if it's not obvious, they're sitting at the top of a ridge line. That means fire is going to travel up that hill. And that's especially important if you have parts of the home that are overhanging that ridge, because heat rises and it gets trapped under overhanging elements of the home like decks or balconies like this. So how about the general landscaping? Lots of river rock or gravel around the structure. What kind of vegetation? Is it really heavy vegetation plantings? Yeah, it's fairly limited landscaping. Short grass. So what type of construction do we see? Yeah, we got a Saltillo tile roof, which is really resistant to embers landing on it. But what does it have at the edge of the roof line? Little entry points. That could be fixed really easily. There's pre-made bird stops to plug those in. What that can do is take a roof that's almost impossible to ignite from the top and allow embers to get up under the roof. So that may be something to think about, is even if you have an ignition resistant roof, are there gaps or areas where embers can get under that roof line? What else? What about the siding?
Stucco.
It's stucco. Yeah, you can see it a little bit better on the computer screen. It's kind of whited out. So stucco siding, and it's got non-combustible enclosure around the foundation. A lot of these homes were built pier and beam and then enclosed because of the dry weather and weather cycles. As far as the landscaping, we got short grass. And then if you look at the landscape material, it's looks like rock enclosing those areas, creating a little bit of a barrier. What does our sidewalks act like? Yeah, they break up the continuity of the vegetation, so a fire burning in this very short grass, if nothing stops it, it can burn directly to that structure. And we know that this landscaping on one side, it did actually get up to the house, but the siding was ignition resistant. So here's our bird stops we talked about. So as we move down our list, we've talked about the type of construction. Let's look at the roof itself. What do you all see on top of that roof? Skylights. What are skylights made out of? We all know plastic melts. It may not burn very easily, but when hundreds of embers land on it and melt it, or it falls away or creates pinholes, that can be a factor. What else do we notice about the roof line? Do we have any gutters? That's a good thing because leaves gather in gutters, and even if the gutters are metal, we usually nail them to that fascia at the edge of the roof, which is often combustible. And so what it does is it generates a place for fuel to accumulate, kindling to accumulate, and then radiate to the siding or the roof of the house. Anything else stand out?
It could go under the tile if they don't put the little spacers in there.
Exactly. That creates that weak link on an otherwise resistant structure.
Hip roof. It's a hip roof.
Yep.
Gabled.
Yep. Exactly. So it's a gabled roof, and underneath those gables, are the soffits enclosed or are they open? So that's a good thing because we talked about heat rises, and if you have open soffits, it can get trapped under there and sustain for quite a while. It can also create another avenue for embers to enter the structure. How about our windows? I can tell you they are double pane, and they have aluminum around the panes themselves, which can melt, but is a lot more resistant to melt than, say, vinyl. And the value of those double pane windows is they have a gas between panes that mitigates heat travel to some degree. And we've seen homes that even the first pane is compromised and that second pane holds up. Because what's right behind those window panes? Yeah, it's wide open. You've got vinyl blinds that can easily melt, can ignite, and then you've opened the door to wildfire to walk right in. So there's not a lot of litter on the roof, which is a good thing. They don't have any trees to drop leaves and litter. But we do have those openings that we talked about. We also have a limited amount of vegetation, but it doesn't take a lot that's growing up under the eaves. Can you guys see that with this guy right here? And then we have some, which is kind of a good thing, short plantings in front of the windows. Window plantings can be a major factor that we see as a common denominator in Texas. Take a really ignition-resistant home and we plant something right in front of the most vulnerable aspect of it that we don't want a bunch of heat radiating through. So maybe they could do a little bit of pruning on this one tree that's kind of going up under the gutters, but for the most part, it's not a vegetative issue. So this is the slope facing down away from the home. As we kind of move out from, we looked at the roof, we looked at the attic vents, the soffits. The crawl space underneath is enclosed, so that's a good thing. And so we talked about our windows and screens. I don't know if you noticed that had metal screening on it. Metal holds up a lot better during wildfire. It doesn't last as long as a vinyl, and it gets rusty and doesn't look pretty. But the reality is if you have single pane windows, that can add a lot of protection to you. So working our way down, what do y'all see nestled amongst the landscape?
Yes.
So propane tanks can be problematic during a wildfire. What do we like to do to hide our propane tanks if we have them?
Bury them.
Some folks bury them, but very often it's a wooden privacy fence or vegetation. These propane tanks are really, really hard to get to ignite. Be quite honest, it takes a lot of heat and a lot of time. But when they do something that we don't want to be there when it does happen is the valve pops and it bleeds off gas very often, like you've seen coming off a refinery distillery. And so if there's nothing around that, it's clean burning gas and it's going to make a pretty flame. If it's surrounded by privacy fences, vegetation, or under your roof line, which we often see people have put it beside the house to hide it, then it could be problematic and it can present also a firefighter safety issue. It also could have been a source for fire to stick around much longer than the fast-moving natural fire. So we had pretty intense fire behavior coming up the side of the house that was facing the slope. The opposite side, where it was flat, where it was grass, we saw very little fire behavior. So that slope really isn't a factor. And if we're going to focus on one aspect of the home, we want to focus on that aspect facing the slope, because that's where the biggest onslaught of direct flame and heat is going to be. Do you have a question, Jim?
Yeah, what's that big, that structure that is off to one side with the roof on it? Yeah, that's up to the right, right?
That's their, over here, that's a deck. I think we'll be able to see it a little bit better. So we're getting back to the back side, and I think that overhang is what you're seeing, Jim.
Yeah, it looks what's actually on the back of the house, right? And it doesn't. Okay.
So there's a,
Oh, right.
yeah, there's a vehicle parked there that burned.
Yeah.
So we can kind of talk about that, because that's not part of the house. We're talking about protecting our house from wildfire. We got to talk about cars now. We're making this awful complex, right? So the reality is, what do every car have on them? Tires. And we all have seen, heard, got in trouble burning a tire, or seeing one that was on fire on the side of the road, burns for a long time, really hot. And if you're parked on concrete, it's maybe not such a big deal. If you park it next to your house in the grass, it can certainly be a factor. So we've got stairs leading up to the home, but they're non-combustible. Very intense fire behavior. The first row of windows is on the top floor, and aesthetically, a lot of people might not like that, but what it did is it elevated that weak link, the exposure of the windows off of the ground, and minimized the heat that was radiating to them, because this house experienced a significant amount of heat flux. So here's kind of the aerial imagery to just give you kind of point of context. Here's the surrounding, Jim. That's, I think, what you're referring to over here off the side. Very intense fire behavior up this slope, almost no fire on the flat ground. And so everything that they did on this side of the house made a huge difference.